The fans are the custodians of the club and they're your main stakeholder.
Every Saturday is a shareholder meeting.
Because everyone wants to know what the heck is Rafael Nadal competing with Didier Drogba in.
Can I just double check? Did you say 400k to 6 million?
3 years.
3 years?
Yep.
I mean, that's phenomenal.
Insane.
We started this in our late 20s, so the issue is going into these clubs and having people take you seriously.
And actually male athletes generally underperforming in that, which gives women's sport in general, from our perspective, a huge growth outlet.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask for an inside story on Didier Drogba. What's he like to work with? Hello and welcome back to another episode of the CF Div Sweeps podcast with me, your host, Rory. After last week's sort of maiden episode, I've kicked off Josh and Ken, and we welcome two guests with us today. Leo, Sam, welcome. It's nice to have you here.
Very exciting. Nice to be with you.
Yep, thanks for having us.
It's okay. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to Moorgate. It's becoming the sort of home for us at the moment. And yeah, I think probably just to get into it, maybe start with a bit of a background of both of you. Don't have to sort of dwell on it too long, but it's interesting because you come from different backgrounds, right?
Yeah, that's right. My background was in law and Sam was in real estate, private equity.
Yeah, Leo, so seems that you were sort of always involved in startups, even when you were studying at Berkeley. You've got a pretty impressive legal background, some big firms, Skadden, Freshfields doing, sports deals for, I think, about 4 years and then PE for another 3. And then, so sort of went back to sports focused PE, if I'm correct. That's sort of where you ended up doing deal rights for, I suppose, for leagues, TV rights, that kind of thing. Had some success on the investing side as well. Saw an IPO in 2021 and a sale of, I think it was called Fact Matter in 2022. And then went on the operational side at Charlton, which is obviously quite a big club, big fan base. And met Sam in 23 and started Chiron. Is that sort of roughly correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah. Good intro.
Yeah, well, we do some due diligence here. And then Sam, yours is sort of equally as impressive, but less so legal and more sort of real estate. So real estate analyst for 4 years, moved to the Common Group, which I think you also co-founded. Is that correct?
Common Sports, so the sports subsidiary within that, yeah.
Okay, wow. And then, partner there. And that was that real estate PE or was that?
No, so Common Group was mainly a healthcare. They started with a healthcare roll-up and then went into VC. And when I met the founder, he wanted to get into sports. And I took a bit of a COVID leap to try something else from my background in real estate, to go into football clubs and help them source opportunities, eventually invested them and operate them. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's pretty cool. After singing my praises on the due diligence, I've let myself down there. But so you sort of helped spearhead their movement into sports, and I can see that you also went to, is it Patra Eisden?
Yes, so that was the second club that we invested in, and in that case, Leyton Orient was the first one where we bought a stake in there, joined the board, and helped them with their management. But in this one, we bought the whole club, and so it was really in our hands. And so I sat on the board there for a couple of years, helped them get promoted from the 3rd division to the 2nd division. They may still go up again this season, so I'm still a fan and still watching. But it was a very hands-on experience in European football and the lower leagues, and trying to get to navigate that whole system.
Okay, nice. And that might be a good chance to bring you sort of both in together, because I think you roughly had sort of your first directorships at football clubs at the same time. How did you find jumping from, a legal or private equity background, whatever it may be, in the professional world to sort of operational at football clubs?
Yeah, I mean, from a Charlton perspective, I started with a 100-day plan, which is effectively, once you close a transaction, what are you going to do to get this thing to a place that you're happy with? And so I sat down with my other board director, Thomas Sangard, who's the majority owner, and I said, what are we going to do to get this club to a place that we can be comfortable with, and really make sure that whatever we do with this club, we take it to a better place than where we found it. Yep. We made 1,000 to-dos. We started off with them, and by the end of 3 years, I think we did 150. Okay. So what you learn very quickly from football operations and boards and stakeholders and fan community groups and everything else involved, it's a very, very complicated industry with a lot of levers that are challenging. And I think cross-applying disciplines in Sam's case, real estate, and mine, law, and with my other director, entrepreneurship, actually, is a really effective tool to take a football club to quite an interesting place. So one of the things, for example, that we did pretty quickly was commercialize, or rather, firstly, professionalize the women's team, and then lead to additional commercialization strategies for the men's and women's teams. And those are the kinds of things that worked really effectively.
And that's something we spoke about briefly off air, which I think would be really good to come on to later, which is sort of the disruption, I suppose, perhaps from female sports into male sports. It seems that there's sort of a nascent industry there, and perhaps lessons for the men's game and the men's clubs to take from what's happening in women's sports.
I think that's a cool part of our strategy, as Chiron and previously with the clubs that we've been involved in and what we've seen, because the men's game is obviously still growing and extremely exciting, but it is a bit locked in a status quo in many ways. The women's game is, at the moment, quite a blank canvas. And so if you take the FA's new deal with a new co, it's a sole initiative to outsource commercialization of women's football into a new vehicle where they can say, let's rewrite the rule book. And that's very interesting because that lets all the businesses around them also support the rewriting of the rule book, which will lead to hopefully quite an interesting football. And where football has struggled in many ways from a business sustainability perspective, women's football might not. And that's what we're looking forward to.
So just to put a fine point to what Chiron actually is, could you just run us through, Chiron Sports and perhaps your backers?
So Chiron Sports was initially, it started off by, I was pitching a football deal to a number of family offices back in January 2023. And following that, I was introduced to Sam. And so Sam and I started jointly pitching this same football deal to a number of family offices. And then two of those family offices, which was Christian Angermeyer's Apeiron and Robin Lauber's Infinitas Capital, said actually we're more interested in sport than a single transaction. We want to build a strategy around this thing. And so we said, oh, that's a really scary concept. Take a moment. And we said, give us some time and we'll work through this. And so we spent a good number of months thinking, what is a sustainable strategy that we can implement for these two family offices, knowing their ambitions? I'll start with Christian on the one hand, which Christian is an extremely ambitious, energetic, disruptive entrepreneur. He's always pushing the frontiers of what is possible. And most people, I'd say most people, when he says something to them, look at him a bit like, is that real? And he has so much conviction. Not only does he make you believe it's real, but he implements it. And we've seen this time and time again, initiating the psychedelics movement for the treatment of mental health, pushing forward the agenda for longevity in a really big way, in a number of other facets, and most recently with the announcement of the enhanced games, which, to the extent that people don't know it, is the opportunity for athletes to participate in sort of Olympic equivalent events, but without restrictions around doping.
Okay.
So it's sort of a testament to human performance and the extension of the living condition. And that's Christian. And from our perspective, that's interesting because we can then take a very disruptive lens as how we look at sport. And on the other hand, we have Robin Lauber, who's been partnered with Christian many times, a Swiss family office that looks mostly at real estate, a little bit at biotech and more generally venture capital. But I'd say it's more investment focused. And so I think, in a sense, that gives us the structure and discipline to combine being pretty disruptive in what we want to try and do, but also in delivering a return that we know can make us consistent and long-term about what we do.
So one question I had, which was sort of the career motivation behind this move into sports and, taking over clubs or getting more involved in the operational side, was really the career motivation behind it. Is that like a long-running plan that you've had, or is that something like an opportunity that's opened up to you since you've sort of been involved in these clubs?
Both our views would be quite interesting here, so maybe I'll do mine and then Sam can do his. But my perspective, I've always looked at different industries and tried to understand where can value be unlocked and where am I interested in being and where does my passion lie. And sport has always been something extremely close to me throughout in different ways. And so when COVID hit the first time round and private equity M&A was a little bit quiet for me at Freshfields, I had a bit of a look around and I thought, where's real values be unlocked in sport? And I realized, I don't think it was such a genius revelation, but I realized that a lot of these teams are going to struggle without people buying tickets and sitting in stadiums. And so I made a list of clubs that I thought could be approachable for a transaction because of a debt situation or an ownership struggle or really just a need for a revitalization of a growth plan. And using my prior investor network from startup investing from the prior 7 years, I created a plan to acquire a club, and that's what led to eventually acquiring Charlton Athletic.
I think we had a very similar path to working in sports, because I was also a major sports fan, particularly football, and couldn't understand how they were so badly operated, especially the larger, very professional teams. I mean, one example was, I remember watching the Championship playoff final between Fulham and Aston Villa a few years back, and Aston Villa, as owner at the time, really bet the house on getting back up to the Premier League, and when that didn't happen, they lost that final. They obviously were in huge trouble, and I just couldn't understand how someone could mismanage that, or at least trust people on the ground to run it so badly for them and take such a big risk. So I think I started looking at, all right, well, why don't we do the same thing that I was doing in my real estate private equity job, which was manage people's money and manage their property, but in this case, the property being a sports asset, is how to manage it professionally for them. And so similarly, I started looking at, okay, obviously I'm not going to play in the big leagues of Aston Villa just yet, but start off in the lower tiers and find clubs that could use that professionalization and bring them up the ladder. So as I started advertising, that's how I eventually met my American partner with the Common Group and started looking for opportunities to do that.
And so in this, I suppose, journey of managing clubs, have you found it different to managing, a real estate asset? What are the sort of learnings there?
There's some major differences, because ultimately, compared to real estate or even other things like portfolios for people, it's very highly connected to your local community. It's a very emotionally tied asset. So there's a lot of stakeholders involved, whether it's the fans, the players, the club staff. I mean, it really, a lot of people depend on the success of their local club. And so it's a lot of added pressure, and it's very emotional. I think, once you get involved there, you realize that the results on the pitch matter so much more than if you're just the casual fan who watches his team on TV. But when you're actually entrenched in it and it really affects everyone in the local community, it adds a lot more. So you have to be able to handle that kind of emotional instability and pressure. So that's a major difference, yeah.
When we were looking at Charlton, we had a conversation with Steve Parish at Crystal Palace to understand how did you get to where you got to? And he said, the first thing you really need to understand is that every Saturday is basically a shareholders meeting. You're going to be judged on your performance then. And so make sure you're prepared with responses to whatever comes out of that game. I mean, he's done quite a good job, so I'd like to take his advice quite seriously.
Every Saturday is a shareholder meeting. That's a very short-term time frame.
But it's the truth, because the fans are the custodians of the club and they're your main stakeholder. And you need to make sure that whatever you're doing for any team or any sports asset in general, that the community with which you're engaging in is supporting the actions you're doing. And that's the real challenge.
And I suppose that actually sort of brings us on to, I suppose the genesis of Chiron, but also its focus going forward. Are you differentiating yourself from peers in the way you manage these stakeholder, shareholder relationships? Or are you sort of innovating in the field? How are you sort of going about differentiating yourselves from the other players?
Yeah, I think when we first sat down, we said, what is sport? And I think we both agreed, probably because of where we came from, it's an ecosystem, and the team is maybe a center of gravity for that ecosystem. And the thing that the ecosystem is surrounded by is a number of things, but community is a giant part of it. And so the relationship of all of those players in the ecosystem is really what directs Chiron's thesis. And in everything we look at, it's really, okay, if you've got a team, how do you tap into the things around? Equally, how do you let them benefit from you? So it's almost symbiotic.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, one of our co-founders, Christian Angermeyer, he believes in being disruptive and taking care of a future community or something that's going to grow looking forward. And so he thinks, and we agree with him, that with the disruption coming in from AI, a lot of people are going to look to live events and connectivity in person a lot more. And that's where sports comes into play, because in reality, you can't really replace sports with AI. I mean, most people, of course, you can do esports and that kind of thing, but most people will still gravitate towards attending things in person and connecting with other fans to watch players in real life. And so we think there's going to be a future growth in sports more than ever because of that. And I think people have more time on their hands to enjoy these kinds of live events. And so we think it's a good time to be investing in it.
Is that part of the sort of value add you guys have at Chiron Sports, is sort of navigating these, as you say, these emerging trends, be it the professionalization of women's sports or AI? I think, is it PSG who did something with cryptocurrency and voting at their club?
Yeah, lots of clubs instigate measures a bit like that to try and deepen engagement with their fan bases and communities. And as Sam rightly said, and is very much backed by Christian and Robin Lauber as well, the two families that support us. Looking at disruption in that way is how we will sort of cement that ecosystem effect. And I think there's a combination of, as AI and tech continues to disrupt and sport and live content remain relevant, because you can't disrupt that, and that's one of the things that's been alive as long as we know, sort of man-to-man combat in essence. I guess the other thing is it also gives people something to hold on to. People support a sports team in the same way they might support political association, or they might support a religion, or whatever it is that they might pick. And we are really strong believers that sport will stand the test of time. And I think in an investment environment where people aren't sure what will stand the test of time, sports asset remains scarce and interesting.
And I suppose to contextualize all this, could we maybe come on to a current deal or an example of the work you're doing and some of these strategies that you've put in place to implement changes and handle these changes?
I think one of the most interesting has got to be Didier Drogba. So Sam, over to you.
Yeah, one of the first deals that we are working on is managing and co-investing with Didier Drogba into his E1 team. So E1 is a new racing series by the same founders of Formula E and also Extreme E, which is the electric rally car racing. And so the concept is electric speedboat racing, essentially. And what's interesting in this is that you have every team owned by a major celebrity. So in our case, Didier Drogba, but there's also Tom Brady, Steve Aoki, Checo Perez, Rafa Nadal. So a lot of big names, and that'll bring a lot of the eyeballs to the races and attract a younger crowd, because we're seeing a trend in which younger fans don't necessarily stick to the same teams. They're not maybe as old school in terms of the tradition of football, for example, but they like celebrities, they like content, they will follow people where they go. And so in this sense, a lot of the fans of these athletes or celebrities will really already have a large following and will gravitate towards their new project, which in this case is the E1 series. So we've been working with Didier for a few months now to manage his team and to race in this new series and help it grow. What's interesting about it is taking obviously the angle of sustainability in sports, which is something a lot of people are thinking about more and more as we go forward. The obvious being some other races that are still very popular but not great for the environment. So how do we change that, and how do we promote sustainability not only in sports but in this case in marine life, for example? So that's what we've been working on, and it's been very interesting to work with a celebrity directly on something that not something that he's playing in, but that he's managing and that he's putting his face on. And so that kind of brand value attracts a lot of new viewers and creates this whole new ecosystem around the sport.
So was part of the strategy in Drogba E1 then to leverage the branding of all these celebrities who may not be involved in sailing or racing per se, and bring them together because the branding is portable?
The following is definitely portable. The branding will take time to build, but at least the thing has garnered an enormous amount of interest because everyone wants to know what the heck is Rafa Nadal competing with Didier Drogba in. And that as a spectacle, I think, has gathered a lot of attention.
Yeah, I think the most viewed video they had was just like a group video call of all the different team owners just telling you how they're going to beat each other on the in the races, and so that actually garnered a lot of attention, and then that translates hopefully to viewership of the races themselves.
How did you go about getting Steve Aoki, Virat Kohli, all these collective people together and to buy into this idea? Or is it really just Drogba that you're working with?
Yeah, we can't take credit for bringing those celebrities in because obviously that was E1's doing. But once they got a couple of people on board, then suddenly other celebrities started to look at it and found it very interesting. And I think that, again, we said the scarcity of sports assets. So in this case, you have 8 teams and they're about to announce the 9th in the next race. And they said that ideally they won't go beyond 12 teams. And so suddenly, as more celebrities look at all the people who are involved, they'll want to get involved as well. And then the value of these teams tends to go up because after a while, there's a limited amount of places to get involved. And so now is really that growth period where a lot of celebrities are putting their hand up and say, well, this is pretty cool, I want to be a part of it.
And I think this is a really interesting case study for how the value proposition works from a ground up basis, in that this thing starts with 0 fans and has 0 revenue from TV. And there is a fixed number of teams. And TV broadcasters and any distributors in general pay probably on a roughly per fan basis how many people are watching this thing, because they can then use that to sell to sponsors and other related distributors. And so if you're a team that's locked in and you know that a broadcaster will pay you X per fan, the moment you get more fans, the business model is pretty clear how to run it. And so and US sport, and we're looking a lot at US sport at the moment, but US sport, the franchise system, is an amazing example of this, because NBA teams, NFL teams, and at some point MLS teams will all follow this exact trajectory, which is there's a locked-in value and fan bases are growing and the availability to watch content is growing, but yet these assets are completely scarce. And that's why you're seeing these pretty large valuations from a typical business perspective, or a multiple perspective at that.
It'd be interesting to, again, touch on this value add idea. So you're working with Drogba in the E1 racing. Like you say, the number of teams is going up. You're getting an increased number of viewers and it's price per viewer. And so the underlying financial mechanics are there. How are you trying to, like you say, add value to really push the growth of this?
Yeah, we're all about trying to find value levers or revenue levers that the team otherwise hasn't obtained. And the most natural way to do that is, well, there's 2 ways really. One, you either build the fan base, because that's more people to buy stuff, or you find more things that they can buy, which is more revenue line items. And in the case of E1, that's an incubation, and so we're still sort of working out where the thing is going to make revenue. Sponsorship will be the main driver for now, TV at some point. But our immediate step that we thought we can do with this thing is increase the fan base quite quickly, so that the asset value of sponsorship, for example, goes up. The number of people that might buy merchandise will go up. And the way we did that was combining it with another investment that we've done, which is an Italian Serie B team, Venezia FC, which is a team we've been partnered with for almost a year, actually. A really interesting football proposition, because they have a really strong business case for off-the-pitch revenues, but also are successful on the pitch from a footballing standpoint. And so what the collaboration now looks like will be a logo exchange on key merchandise. So the idea being that the fans of Didier Drogba and Team Drogba will now be interested in Venezia FC, which they're targeting as everyone's second team. So that plays really nicely for them. Equally, for Team Drogba, it gives access to a global brand, which is Venezia FC. It's also the city of Venice. And going to our belief of sustainability in sport, Venice is seen to be the sustainable capital, or is trying to be a sustainable capital of the world. And so the union between the racing team and the football team is a really nice way to sort of state this publicly.
That's fascinating. Sam, anything more to add on the value add side?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from our operational expertise, is getting our hands dirty into a team and seeing where have they really struggled to monetize certain areas, or where are they maybe not taking care of their fans in a certain part. It comes to certain investments where we see that they're very nascent. There's a lot of growth. I mean, if we're looking at US sports like NBA or MLS, obviously these are large, very professional organizations, so we're not going to come in and pretend that we can turn things around. But when it comes to new sports, or sports that are going through a bit of a revamp, I mean, you're looking at the way things are changing in, let's say, golf or tennis or whatever. There is room for us to get operation involved and see what other ideas that we can bring in and help the sport or the team grow.
Although from a private equity background, you guys seem very ingrained and aware of the stakeholder base. And so some of the themes you've touched on are it being an ecosystem, or you're building ties with the fans or identifying the wants and needs they have. So this isn't about squeezing the bottom line. It's, like you say, you growing the fan base, or like increasing merchandise or things and experiences for them. So it seems very value add, but not just for the shareholders, for the stakeholders as well. But I'd be interested to know more about the actual mechanics of how you go about putting a deal together, or finding a club to work with, or really just, some of these league rights you've mentioned. How do you go about navigating that landscape?
I think you've got it absolutely right. Working on costs is one thing, but working on revenue is much more relevant for the stakeholders around. And because we see football and sport in general as so under-monetized in many areas, there's ample opportunity to do things. The other thing to say is, in the current debt environment, the traditional leveraged private equity deals are probably more challenging today, at least from a valuation standpoint, and also probably a return standpoint. And so in the area that we're operating, which is growth, there's much more focus on tangible operational improvements. And that's one of the reasons why Sam and I are frankly so busy getting our hands dirty in all of these teams, because that's where the value is to be found. And I think in terms of putting these transactions together, we spend a lot of time doing research. We generally go thesis first. So we think, as Sam mentioned about his and my background actually, what is an issue in the sports landscape that we see today? You know, is ticketing efficient? Is women's football a commercially viable business product? Is tennis sustainable? Are the number of tournaments the right number? Are they in the right countries? Are the right people involved? And we start asking all these questions. And then we come up with a thesis and we say, actually, we think there's much more growth to be had in Major League Soccer because the fan base growth is there. The precedent sports assets are there. If you look at NFL and NBA and those, but for whatever reason, MLS teams today are still losing a lot of money, and there's still more growth trajectory to be had. So we come up with a thesis, for example, like this. And we say, this seems interesting. We then spend a good amount of time talking to experts in the industry. So we'll talk to owners or players or fans or sponsors, or really trying to understand the full picture of how does this industry work? Are we right about our thesis? We'll then try and finesse the thesis and pick a pinpoint where we can see value. And we'll say, okay, and I'll use Venezia here. We think there's more merchandise that can be sold in football. What's the best club on the planet that does it? And we start looking. And we notice, and this is Venezia's case, in the last 3 years, they've increased merchandise sales from 400K to almost 6 million. And you've got to ask, well, how did they do that? And why aren't other clubs doing that? And the answer is they're in a very unique situation to be able to capitalize on the city of Venice, and at the same time, capitalize on fashion. And if you Google Venezia FC, most of the time, the first thing you see is a number of models wearing these football jerseys. And that was how they sold merchandise in the way they did and delivered this kind of growth.
Can I just double check? Did you say 400K to 6 million?
3 years.
3 years?
Yep.
I mean, that's phenomenal.
Insane. And so when we saw this, we suddenly thought, they're on the right idea. And that is a thesis we can get behind. So then we ask ourselves, who else can do that? Do they have a moat? Who can compete with that? And we realize, okay, PSG have done a good job. They've partnered with Jordan, and now they have a large merchandise business as well. But the problem with a club like PSG is that's still a small part of their overall business because the player wages for PSG's team are astronomical. Whereas in a sized club like Venezia, actually that merchandise business could actually be equal to or complementary to or even larger than the football business. And so in that sense, it becomes a really interesting case study. So now that we've got our thesis and we say merchandise is interesting, Venezia have done a really good job at this, we then look at the management team and we say, is this a group of people that we know that we can work with and that are going to stay with this club for a good amount of time, and mostly that are incentivized for the journey. And in this particular instance, it's a group of Americans, a number of former Goldman Sachs partners and other real entrepreneurs in all sorts of industries, trying to rewrite the rulebook of how football can make money. And once we saw the combination of the opportunity and the strong management team, we thought, actually, this is something we can back. And I think so far we've only been proven steadily right by the management team. They have stood by their word, and every time they deliver. And this summer, we're going to see something enormous from Venezia, which it's going to really surprise everyone. We're excited about that.
Okay, so we can set our calendars for Venezia this summer.
Absolutely.
Any more sort of teasing on what might come?
I can't say. All I can say is it's big.
And I suppose before we move on I wanted to get into some of the more emerging trends, and we've touched on brands and I hinted at some changes in female sports particularly, but I would be remiss, given the amount of Chelsea fans that will be hitting me up in a group chat, if I didn't ask for an inside story on Didier Drogba. Without getting you guys in trouble, what's he like to work with?
He's great. I mean, like most people would expect, is that he's actually a very, very nice guy, very humble, and he's very ambitious as well. I think he wants to do a lot for Africa, for his country, for his foundation. So not only is he involved in investments, but he's involved with a lot of charities as well. And he's overall just a fun guy. I mean, the first time we spoke to him, when we were set up by E1 to have a call, I think we were both a bit nervous, but I sort of tried to break the ice by saying, oh, I'm from Egypt and I watched you play in the AFCON final in 2006. And he's like, thank you for reminding me. I missed the penalty that day, so I don't ever want to revisit that occasion. And I was like, yeah. So it was a bit. He took the joke well. So far we've developed a pretty good relationship ever since.
That's a good thing to remind him of.
Yeah,
no doubt at a first meeting.
He's a great guy, and he's extremely ambitious as well in terms of his bigger aims, promoting, in our instance, marine sustainability, but the broader objectives of Africa as well. And I guess one of the learnings that we've had is if you do a good job with someone, generally they want to keep working with you. And so we're pretty hopeful that we'll maintain a great relationship with him and do other projects and keep building around the principles that we share together.
And this actually sort of brings me on to my next topic, which is a bit amorphous, but it's really what is a brand. And I suppose either using Didier as an example or not, it'd be interesting to know from your guys' perspective just how sort of malleable is a brand, how persistent is it? Because obviously he's past his playing days now. And you said something earlier about brands not quite being portable immediately, but they can be with time. It'd be good to get your guys' takes on just what is a brand in the modern day.
I think a lot of players or athletes in general have become a lot smarter on how to promote themselves. I think in the past, a lot of players really didn't think about their brand until, we saw in the 90s, David Beckham was maybe the first one to come out and start doing photo shoots or fashion ads and that sort of thing. And that just started to grow from there. And beyond that, now a lot of them have become a lot smarter in terms of what to do with their career earnings, because beyond retirement, there's not much income if they're not getting their salaries or whatever. And so they've gotten smarter in terms of using their earnings to invest into either future sports assets or other areas that they're interested in. So now we have multiple athlete billionaires. So I think Magic Johnson was just announced as a billionaire. Prior to that, you had LeBron James, Michael Jordan. And so they've managed to keep their brand going as not just an athlete, but a smart investor, a charitable, philanthropic person. And a lot of the athletes are learning to do that also and preparing for their retirement to do that.
I'd add one point to that, which is I remember reading an article, or it was a comment of Mark Andreessen commenting on the future of consumer. And one of the points that he made was that celebrity-led brands will be the future because they're relatable. It's very easy to say, I know Didier Drogba, I know his style. If he launched a really cool African athleisure brand, I get what that's about and maybe I can associate with that. By contrast, if Sam and I launch a brand called Africa Athleisure, I don't think anyone's going to care about it. And so suddenly you quite quickly see how important an individual-led brand like that can be. And I think that's definitely something that we're working on with a number of people, actually, and it's something we'll continue to promote.
And is that a new learning for you two both in terms of that slightly more qualitative branding aspect? Is that something you've had to pick up?
I think it all goes to relatability and how you understand relatability. And it's also why sports teams in general are good brands, because they're relatable. People generally know what it means to be a Chelsea fan. That has a thing. People know what Didier Drogba is about. That has a thing. So I think the thing we've really learned is how important relatability is, authenticity too with a brand. And I think if you can carry that forward in a way that's maybe long term as well, you'll create a really great following.
Well, I'm an Arsenal fan, so I know all about long-term suffering. Mikel Arteta, if you're listening, please do something.
Have you seen the documentary Man City treble victory?
No, I have not. I have not put myself through that. So going back a step, I suppose, just to, we're talking about brands being able to sort of transcend sport because they can relate to the consumer ultimately. We spoke off camera about something quite interesting, which was there's been a change in the way fans, consumers, I suppose, whatever you call them, actually relate to clubs and their sport. And you were saying that, they're now more tied to the player and I suppose the player's brand than they are the club. Is that something that you guys have really seen develop over the last few years?
Yeah, I think, it goes to the number of interactions that players have with their fans on a regular basis. So I can't remember the numbers of Cristiano Ronaldo's followers. I don't know if...
Couple 100 million.
Yeah, it's a serious number, but the point is it's probably 4 times what Real Madrid is. And you think, who's a bigger establishment, Real Madrid or Ronaldo? And you pretty quickly realize it's Ronaldo. And I think that all goes down to relatability, but also how much they're interacting with their fan base and how they present a real person to be a part with.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, Ronaldo's a good example because there's a lot of fans that will traditionally support their teams and pass it down to their kids or whatever. But globally, let's say if you're not based in Madrid, you would follow Ronaldo around the world once he leaves to different clubs, and you continue to support him and then start to follow that club. And so that's why I think that's a key reason as to why, let's say, Al Nassr got Ronaldo as one of their players, because they knew that their social media following would skyrocket after that, and it did. And then, to the point of women's sports, I mean, it's strange that some sports caught on early on. Tennis, golf, for example, the women's sport was almost equal to the men's in terms of the prize money and when they were showcased and the distributions that they had, and so obviously the fan base as well. Whereas football, for whatever reason, just was very, very slow to adopt that. And so finally we're starting to see people realize, well, we have a whole market of half the world's population that aren't as interested in the most popular sport in the world. And so how do we get them involved? And it's, taken a few years, but there's been a huge uplift, and we're seeing crazy growth in the women's game, both in the US and now in the UK. And so it's an area that we also want to help develop, because taking that from the US and the UK to the rest of the world the same way that the men's game has would be not only good for investors, but also good for fan bases, good for people to get involved in sports. I mean, even in Saudi Arabia establishing their national team a couple of years ago, that all of that's great and very positive socially as well.
You guys have definitely done this before, because that was my next topic, which was on the sort of the disruption within female sports and leading into male sports. It seems because female sports clubs have had less of a following than the male counterparts until recently, at least, they've not only had a chance to, I suppose, rewrite their own rulebook, but now almost leapfrog the men in certain regards. And it seems it's being led by this female athlete being in charge of her own brand, and that really boosting the club. Is that roughly what you guys are sort of getting at?
That's definitely right. You can look at Angel City in the US, which was really the story's barely even 5 years old, and it's probably the most successful women's sports team in history, arguably. And the reason for that is they had a clean slate to write the rules from. Like you say, they could decide what should a game day look like for their fans. What do their fans even care about? What happens between the first match and the second match are the things that they can do in the middle. That obviously generates new streams of revenue. How important are the individual players' profile versus the teams, and can they be interlocked somehow? And I think that's where the combination of female athletes performing very well from a social media perspective week by week, which is very helpful for clubs, and actually male athletes generally underperforming in that, which gives women's sport in general, from our perspective, a huge growth outlet, because there's an opportunity there which they're able to do, and for whatever reason men have been lagging at. And that's interesting.
That's very interesting. Sam, is this something that you also obviously focus on with clients?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example, because why did they grow so quickly in just a short period of time? And it goes back to the discussion that we had on the brand of celebrities. I mean, one of the co-owners is Natalie Portman and Alexis Ohanian, and all these celebrities already garner a lot of attention, and so immediately people start to look to these teams, and they leapfrogged all the other teams in the NWSL very quickly because of that. And so using that celebrity angle and creating the docuseries like they did, I mean, we've seen that with a lot of other sports, for example, the Drive to Survive with Formula One. So creating that added content that's just off the pitch, again, drives a lot more on the brand and allows people to connect to the teams or the assets in a different way.
Leo, I suppose this may be slightly more for you on a legal side, but does this introduce an element of key man or key lady risk, where if the players themselves are becoming, the brand more so than the club, how does the club handle transfers or anything like that?
It's a very good question, actually, and it's more an incentivization question than a legal question, because you need to ensure that each individual isn't acting as an individual, but is acting in the best interest of the team. That's what a sports team is about. But at the same time, they soon become aware that their value individually could be greater than the team's. And so one of the other things that we're very interested in, and this goes back to rewriting the rule book, is can you change incentivization on a bigger level? Can you find a way where acting individually is good for the team and vice versa? And that's something we're thinking about. And that's where you start cross-applying disciplines, because the same thing happens in private equity. How do you stop a really, top-performing executive from leaving? It's the same point. It's a vesting plan. Yeah. And so you have to start thinking about similar concepts and translating them into sporting concepts.
Well, I think it was Charlie Munger that said, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. Yeah. So if you guys are rewriting the rule book, this must keep you up at night almost, wondering how you draw the line and keep that balance.
I think it goes to why we spend so long on research.
So one recurring theme that seems to have come up is that your network has been key for your professional success. Do you have any advice for our audience who are perhaps anywhere from associate to director at a bank, who are really working on that networking side? And obviously that's what we do and help them with in managing their network and sustaining and fostering relationships for the long run.
I think the one thing we definitely have in common, which we both did in separate ways, it's funny enough to pitch an opportunity. And I think neither of us were afraid to do that. And you never really know what door is going to be opened as a result of that, whether it's the first one that you happen to pitch to or another one. And I found, at least in the last 10 years of doing this, that's opened a lot of doors. And I also would say never be surprised if a parallel door opens when you don't expect it to. And so, for example, if you are involved in a charitable initiative, that might open something else for you. If you're involved in a sporting initiative, vice versa. And I think as long as you prove yourself in good work and good products, and in our case, hopefully good returns, people keep backing you. And I think I'd like to hear from you on Coley, but with Thomas, in my case, I think he's there anytime for a call, a coffee, another transaction, and that's because it worked.
So being accountable, and like you say, if you do good, diligent work, hopefully those relationships sort of sustain themselves in some sense.
I think so.
Yeah, I think backing yourself is key. It's something, if you really have an idea of how you want to get involved in the industry and where you can fit in, I think that's super important, because even when I was speaking to people that I had known in working in football already, a lot of them had said to me, don't do it. Do not get involved in football. Trust me, it's a bad idea. And I didn't listen to them, because I really did think there was an opportunity to clean up a few things or add some different ideas into football. And as I continued to advertise that, that's where I met my former partner, Coley. And I think being able to deliver on that is what made just a fortuitous meeting turn into an actual investment and whole plan, and then eventually a career. So I think just to continue to do that if you believe that that's what you want to be working on. Because unfortunately with sports, there isn't a very clear path to get involved. It's not as traditional as, let's say, banking or real estate or accounting, that sort of type of thing. So yeah.
Sam, that was actually going to be my next question, was any advice for breaking into the industry? But it sounds like there is no clear route.
Well, it's gotten better, so I don't want to say that there is no clear route. I mean, definitely in previous years, there wasn't a very obvious path to take from university to say, I want to work in sports. But nowadays, there are actually a lot of university programs out there, the master's degrees that are focused on sports, business, and management, sports, that type of thing. And that will lead you into different roles, either in teams or in leagues or whatever. So that's definitely one route that people can take. Otherwise, it is getting involved into things from the ground up, and so getting into teams and helping on the management side, and you're working your way up. Unfortunately, some teams, it's not very well paid. It's not something that's a very lucrative career, let's say like banking. But if it's something that you really enjoy, then it's a rewarding in another sense, until you work your way up into a management level position that is a little more financially rewarding, shall we say.
So the pathway is still there, but it's there's a few steps on the ladder.
Mm-hmm. I'd also say don't underrate your own discipline. If I think of good CEOs in sport, they're often accountants, they're often lawyers, they are occasional bankers. In the case of AC Milan at the moment, he's going through a bit of a tough patch. But generally speaking, that's where these people come from. And it's usually cross-applying your learnings from past experiences into sport, where what you think you know is regular and repeat, but when you take it into a team that's never done it before, you're offering a completely new perspective. Okay. And so I think my initial main value add in Charlton Athletic was just cleaning things up, making sure it was a steady, legally secure position that you could build a football team around. And I think you could do that with almost any sort of strong.
I do think people have a tendency to underplay just how transferable some of their skills are.
Yeah.
And the reality, some of these topics that we've touched on are things like incentives, which, that is transferable across all domains, whether it be, in professional sport or sort of professional, services, banking, whatever. So a lot of those skills and the topics we touched on are definitely transferable. I thought we could end with a quick segment on just the changing of the guard in sport, because you guys have a bit of an inside line, and I thought it'd be interesting to know your thoughts on perhaps the change that we see as a younger generation come through. So I'm thinking, Hamilton and Verstappen. You've got it across all disciplines. You've got Messi and Ronaldo changing to Mbappe and Haaland. You've got the changing of the guard in tennis. Do you guys ever think about these things? Does it affect your decisions? Does it affect your view, or is it just a cyclical change in a structurally secure market that is sports?
I'd say it is a cyclical change that you see a lot in sports, but one key difference is, I said this earlier, but players are getting a lot smarter. So someone like Mbappe being sort of the next generation, he's realized his value at such a young age that it's allowed him to have a little more leverage. You can see the way he negotiates with PSG and the rumors every year about whether he'll leave or whether he'll stay, and how much they pay him to stay and how much he wants to go to Real Madrid. And so those kinds of things will definitely affect sports assets going forward. I mean, I know in the NBA, they're already having discussions about giving players equity, and that will change our investment thesis for sure. I think if we look at a lot of teams, we have to realize how powerful, how valuable these players are to them, because they have a lot more pull than they used to.
Yeah, which goes right to the point of incentivization. To do newer athletes, offer a new kind of platform for incentivization and ownership. Should they be a part of the project? And I think certain athletes have been innovating with that. We saw Messi and MLS as one example of that. Yep. And I think other people will follow suit. It's a very interesting concept. And it's good for both, because ideally incentives are aligned. I also think that there's also the characters that are the newer athletes versus the existing athletes. And I think the newer athletes are better content creators. And so the monetization of, let's take Roger Federer, was very strong, but Sinner or Alcaraz could be 10x that, because they know how to cater to their audience. They know their audience. Plus they've got Netflix at their side. And so one of the reasons we're really interested in sport as an asset is because, yes, you have an athlete, but you've also got a huge content creator running alongside that.
That's a good point, actually. I've just thought of the boxer Ryan Garcia. Right. He's been one of the sort of forerunners in that, certainly in boxing. He's got a massive following. And it's true, what you're touching on, these incentives, it's no different to a normal business. You want your key men or key women to have a stake in the business that they spend all their time building and, are representing week in, week out. So what's one of the risks in giving all these players sort of their branding power? I'm thinking in the digital age, one mistake spreads like wildfire. So is there increased risk in this model?
I think these players, and especially those that are stronger content creators, have a much higher degree of responsibility. And we can't forget, I know myself at 18, I can't imagine the responsibility these guys have day in, day out. And that's just not on the pitch, that's now off the pitch as well. So if you take the case of Saka, who's a great ambassador, I know you're an Arsenal fan, you're welcome. Obviously, missing a penalty was a huge situation for him, and for many reasons. And I think off the pitch, I can't imagine what he went through there. And I think in that context, you've got to appreciate that these guys have an enormous responsibility, but that it's also on the team to support them. And I think that's where the team becomes really relevant, linking with the individual, because the team has to support them. And the other players know that, because they could also go through a similar risk situation at any point in time.
And I think to add to that, we would want to keep the focus also on the main point here, which is winning, right? Because ultimately, as much as you want to drive content, and we're saying that these are all ways to add revenue, at the end of the day, fans, especially in football, will only care about the results on the pitch. So I think we don't want to distract players too much by making them do all these ads and content creation with documentaries and everything. Is ultimately keeping the focus on giving the fans what they really want, which is winning. So I think it's making sure that there's a balance there and not putting too much pressure on them. One example a few years ago was two of the best content creators out there were Paul Pogba and Jesse Lingard, and they were doing great with social media after games. But then fans start to get upset because the team wasn't performing very well. So it's just, how do you keep the balance and maintain the focus on the asset, which is a sports asset ultimately?
So performance comes first, and all the branding, etc., comes second. And
yeah, this is value add that we discussed. These is all things to add value, but you don't want to take away from the main purpose of the asset.
And I suppose if any mistakes or misbranding were to happen, if you're performing well on the pitch, you're more likely to be forgiven that as well.
For sure.
That's definitely right. And as at least in the teams that we've been involved in various board capacities, the general view is support good initiatives. So if there's a charity that a player cares about, support that. Off you go, 100% behind that. If it's pure commercialization or monetization, there's an open-minded to that. But at the same time, you have to work with a team because performance comes first.
How have you guys found coming into clubs and implementing new systems and trying to innovate and adopt new approaches? Have you been met with any resistance? How have you managed the heritage of the club and the way things have historically been done?
It's a great question and a very sensitive one because it really goes to how well does the club know its fan base and how do you keep those two things extremely aligned. And the best mechanism I found, at least in my experience, and I'm sure Sam's will mirror, is it's a constant communication and dialogue and really trying to understand, am I doing what the fans ultimately would have done if it were me? And you've always got to say, well, I'm just going to try and do the best I can whilst I own the club, but eventually someone else is going to. So the only thing I can really do are things which I think will improve it in the short term and get as much for really the long term and get as much feedback as possible from everyone around as I go about that exercise. Now, there are times where groups won't agree with you. Maybe you have to sell a star striker because you've had such a good offer that means you can increase the longevity of the club for more seasons or bring in other more sustainable players or younger players even. And in that instance, you have to take a brave decision. And I think our view, we do operations, but we're mostly investors. And our view really is to surround ourselves with the best people out there that can help us make the best decisions.
I think the added challenge to that is we're both relatively young. So we started this in our late 20s. So the issue is going into these clubs and having people take you seriously. I mean, a lot of these fans have been fans for decades, and a lot of the people running the clubs have also been working there for decades. And so they'll say to you, this is how it's always been run. And so it's about you really convincing them that the traditional way may not be the best way forward. And in many ways, their age comes with wisdom, but there's also things that need to change within football clubs for it to adapt to a new world. And so the challenge for us is to really get that message across and help them understand that, we're catering to a younger crowd as well. And so how to move the club forward it has always been a challenge, but I think we managed to get that message across.
And out of interest, is your individual reputations or has your reputation at Chiron Sports, you mentioned promotions earlier, has that started to help? Are you noticing you get more goodwill from fans at the beginning, or do you still have to win them over with a good start?
I'd say overall it's very positive. I think people like positive disruption and ambition. And I think because we've both had enough, maybe not enough, as there's never enough experience, but some experience to understand where some of the mistakes can happen. We just go in and try to do our best and try, as I said earlier, try to prove ourselves with hard work. And if we can gain the support of fans and other stakeholders in that way, I think that's the best we can do.
Leo, Sam, this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers have too. Where can people follow you in terms of either Chiron Sports or if they just want to follow Team Drogba? Where can they find you?
Yeah, I mean, we have our website, which will be posting regular updates about what we're up to. We have our LinkedIn page, but more importantly, our assets. We have Team Drogba's next race in Venice on May the 12th. And so please watch out for that. And then at the end of the season, we'll have Venezia's results in Serie B and hopefully promotion to Serie A. So just keep track of those.
I think that's a really good place to leave it. And it's been really interesting. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.